Good afternoon to most of the country, and good morning to my West Coasters. As Michelle said, my name is Jennifer Nandu, and I'm a program officer with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I have the privilege of being a moderator for today's stellar lineup to have a discussion on funding for social and emotional learning and universal prevention in schools. It has been RWJF's pleasure to support the work of Georgetown Center for Health and Healthcare in Schools in their development of numerous social and emotional learning tools, because we know that in order to do our part to build a culture of health, we must make the investments that support children in one of their most important quests, success and academic achievement that will ultimately open up opportunity to pursue fulfilling and productive lives. Frederick Douglass once said, "It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." But far too many of our children enter the classroom broken. Each year, the majority of children, 6 in 10, will be exposed to violence. Many more will be exposed to traumas, whether that be the adversity experienced by persistent poverty and hunger, or something like a premature death of a parent. Unfortunately, that means that children may enter the classroom with baggage and burdens that may affect their ability to learn. And we need to support other teachers and other educators in their journeys to help students achieve. Social emotional learning and promoting children's health and well-being is one tool that can help with classroom management. We know that there's true energy around finding more supports to help children and in turn help teachers, because of classroom management can burn out our educators and suppress the learning environments that we've tried to create. But we also know that it's essential that we have the resources, the ideas to harness finances and identify the strategies to make this a more natural part of the school day. So this is why RWJF is here today, and I'm so glad that so many of you have joined us. We have an enormous amount of interest in this webinar, and as I've said, we have a fabulous lineup of panelists. So let's start. I'm pleased to introduce Olga Price, Director of the Georgetown Center for Health and Healthcare in Schools. Olga?
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to start off by telling you a little bit about our center. The Center for Health and Healthcare in Schools, which is actually at the George Washington University Milken Institute School of Public Health. It has a goal where what we aim to do is to maximize opportunities for learning by supporting children's health and well-being. The center has been working for over 30 years, often in partnership with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, to advance effective school health programs and practices and policies. And we focused more recently on the finance and advocacy strategies that have been shown to lead to the long-term sustainability of effective school-connected health initiatives. So diving in on the next slide, as Jennifer actually already shared, it seems important to mention that the social and the environmental context within which many of our students live really create numerous challenges that, when left unaddressed, often impede the students' ability to learn. So there have been numerous national surveys and epidemiological studies that indicate that these challenges do impact a significant number of our young people throughout the United States, and that educators in classrooms across the country have firsthand knowledge of how social, emotional, environmental, and economic conditions really do create barriers to effective learning. For example, annually, 1 in 5 students suffers from symptoms of mental health problems that negatively affect their ability to function at home, in school, or in their communities. According to a 2009 national survey of young people ages 17 and younger, as Jennifer mentioned, more than 60% of children surveyed reported direct or indirect exposure to violence. Recent data indicates that more than 20% of U.S. children live in families with incomes below the federal poverty level. In addition to these potentially stressful life conditions, classrooms everywhere have felt a dramatic demographic shift in their students, with 1 in 4 students being an immigrant or a child of immigrants. And when cultural dissonance exists between the home and the school community, this increases students' risks of poor academic and health outcomes as compared to their native-born peers. So strengthening students' social and emotional competencies and creating opportunities for the development of these skills is valuable not only for those who've experienced challenges, but are necessary for all children to become active learners and productive adults. So before we move on, and talk about the connection between social emotional learning and academic performance, we want to ask you what you think is meant by social and emotional development. So there's a poll that should be on your screen, and we ask that you vote and check all responses that you think apply. Having strong social and emotional skills means that children can recognize their emotions and describe interests and values, manage their stress and control their impulses, empathize and take another's perspective, cooperate, seek and provide help, persevere through challenges, and resolve conflict. So please click on your screen and vote, and let's see what we as a community think it means to have social and emotional skills. Terrific. Well, I think we have a very informed audience because really the majority recognize that in essence, all of these traits are actually social, emotional in nature and are known to make important contributions in and of themselves to students' academic success. So moving on to our next slide. Depending on the state that you live in, the research that you might have access to or the national leaders and influencers that have influenced your thinking, there are terms that may resonate more or less with yourself and with those in your community. Some refer to these non-cognitive skills as social emotional development, social emotional learning, and in some communities we may be describing character development or a combination of these phrases, but ultimately all of these refer to a process for acquiring a set of personal competencies that are not necessarily innate but are learned and that facilitate an individual's ability to effectively live their lives. For example, CASEL, a partner of our centers, which stands for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, has categorized these skills into 5 main groupings: those that are about self-awareness, those that are about self-management, those that are about social awareness and relationship skills, and those that are about responsible decision-making. Considering the activities that promote social emotional development in educational settings, the things that might typically come to mind are specific programs conducted often by adults and that are aimed to improving the skills in youth themselves through interactive and experiential strategies. But there are actually a number of other approaches that can help create the conditions that strengthen social and emotional development. These include ways that healthy relationships can be developed and how a nurturing school environment fosters greater trust and respect among students, among adults, and between adults and students. Another target of intervention includes the school environment itself. Often school climate changes involve professional development and training that builds the knowledge and the capacities of the adults in the education setting so that changes in practice and even in school-wide norms can be achieved. Furthermore, there are numerous examples of supportive school, district, or state-level policies, guidances, or standards, some of which we'll hear about later in this webinar, as well as are featured in the funding guide, that help embed social emotional practices within the education system. Evidence is quite robust that implementing social emotional learning and universal behavioral health interventions leads not only to improvements in emotional health and well-being, but to increases in academic performance and educationally relevant behaviors. The center compiled an annotated bibliography of the empirical literature for approximately the last 12 years, that's actually available for free on our website, that demonstrated consistent reductions in absenteeism and discipline referrals and suspensions among students for schools that implemented social emotional learning versus those that did not. Additionally, engagement in school showed improvements in grades, standardized test scores, which increased when compared to schools and students that did not participate in SEL activities. There are communities and educators that won't need additional convincing that social emotional learning is an important element to meeting their academic goals, but some may feel at a loss about the programs that would be the best or the approaches that would be the best match for their district or their school building, or that have the best evidence in support of their impact. There are numerous resources and sites that can be of assistance in this regard. Again, CASEL's Guide to Effective Social Emotional Learning Programs is a great resource. as are the federally sponsored sites such as the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices and the What Works Clearinghouse. Also, I should mention that CASEL's currently undertaking a project called the Collaborating District Initiative, where they're working closely with 8 school districts across the country committed to implementing social and emotional learning programs and practices district-wide. Those learnings from the project will be available in the coming year and will advance our understanding of the best practices in institutionalizing SEL in large systems. So you should make sure to take a look at the CASEL website for that. But what we've found at the center in our exploration of the methods for advancing SEL and other universal prevention strategies is that a common barrier to the sustainability of effective and valued programs is the perceived lack of available funding to support these kinds of activities. We have conducted a series of key informant interviews of state and local leaders across the country in education, but also in other child-serving sectors, and we're repeatedly met with this question. How can we expand or even maintain prevention programs delivered in schools when there's really no funding to support that? Our understanding of available funding had us ask ourselves, is there really a prohibition on the use of federal funding, for example, to maintain prevention services or programs? In particular, we knew that an academic solution that didn't attend to the social and emotional needs of students would have limited success. So why couldn't states and school districts use federal education dollars, for example, to support their efforts to improve achievement? Our interviews led us to the conclusion that many were convinced that the use of funds in this manner was not possible. So we engaged our partners at the Center on Education Policy to conduct an in-depth analysis of a number of funded federal education programs. That really was the genesis of this funding guide. So I'm now going to turn it over to our partner, Diane, from the Center on Education Policy, to share more details about the funding guide, how it's organized, and the information that's incorporated within it.
Thanks, Olga. Again, my name is Diane Stark-Rutner, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Center on Education Policy. By way of background, the Center has been around since 1995. We started out as a nonprofit organization, but then in 2002, when our founder, who was Jack Jennings, when he retired, we became a center at George Washington University. We are advocates for public education and improved public schools. And so the bulk of our work has been around studying policies and programs that are intended to support and improve public education. We've monitored the implementation of the No Child Left Behind Act, the federal stimulus program. We've surveyed states and districts on the implementation of the Common Core and have followed many issues related to assessments such as state high school exit exams and career and technical education tests. When Olga approached us about working with her and her center on this guide, it seemed like a perfect match of expertise. Olga has extensive knowledge of school health-related issues and social emotional learning, and we have deep knowledge of federal K-12 programs. So I think the guide that resulted from this partnership really shows some great expertise on this issue. So as Olga said, I'm going to talk about how this guide was created and highlight some of its features. First of all, when we decided that we would do this, we limited our research, our discovery on the Elementary and Secondary Education Act programs. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, it's been around since 1965, and you may be more familiar with its latest set of amendments, which is the No Child Left Behind Act. But it represents the major federal K-12 funding for education. A second element that we had to this guide is that we only wanted to look at programs that actually received an appropriation for the most recent fiscal year, because it really didn't make sense to us to do a funding guide if there wasn't really funding available for the program. So the first thing we did when to create this guide is we started with the statutory language that was passed by the Congress and signed into law by the President to see if there were any specific provisions related to social emotional learning or any related provisions that could open the door to support those efforts. And once we did that, we then looked at the purposes of the program, and if it seemed like a program had a purpose and it would support social emotional learning, but it didn't have any specific language, we then went to federal regulations and guidance to see if there was more information from the U.S. Department of Ed on how those funds could be spent. And the result was we came up with about 15 programs under EOCA that we believe can support social and emotional learning. There's 12 programs that are rather explicit about how the funds can be used in this manner, and they're fairly major programs. The Title I program, the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program, school improvement grants, the Title II program that supports teacher and principal professional development and recruitment, rural education. And as you can see from the list on the slide, there's quite a few programs there. We also found a few programs where it may be a little bit more implicit that the purpose of the program seemed like they would support social and emotional learning, but it wasn't as clear-cut. And we included them in the guide because we think it's worth a good shot at trying to incorporate them into your funding strategy. And they include the Migrant Ed program, the Dropout Prevention Act, and the Alaska Native program. So for each of these programs in the guide, we have a set of information. We summarize the purpose of the program. We talk about the amount of funding provided for each program for the 2 most recent years. We described how the funds are distributed and which entities can receive the funding. And then we actually include the statutory, regulatory, or guidance language that allows funds to be spent on social emotional learning or prevention-related activities. And then we also have a link to the U.S. Department's website for that specific program so that users can get more information. And probably most importantly, we have throughout included examples of districts and schools and states that are using ESEA to fund and implement social emotional learning programs. I have a couple of cautions about the guide. One thing to keep in mind is that although the programs that we highlight in this guide can be used to support social and emotional learning programs, it's not the primary purpose of the program. Now, for example, Title I, I think most folks would say that that's for supporting math and English language arts instruction and for students in low-income schools. But we clearly found that social emotional learning would be an activity that could be supported. So it may just take a little convincing of folks in the district office or the state to use the funds in that manner. And today we're really lucky because we have Principal Kirchner here who has done this and can actually speak about her experience in using the Title I dollars for this purpose. My last caution is that the handful of programs that we listed here are formula grant programs, meaning that the funds flow by formula to the state and then from the state to a school district. So they're sort of in-house and in the system. But a number of the programs are competitive grant programs, which means that districts or schools or nonprofit organizations would need to apply to the state or to the U.S. Department of Ed to get the funding and compete with other entities. So we're in luck again today because we have Dana Carr here with us, who is a former U.S. Department of Education official, and she also helped with the research for this guide. And she's going to talk about some of the strategies you should keep in mind when applying for federal grants.
Great. Thank you so much, Diane. As Diane just said, I am Dana Carr, and I'm currently a consultant right now, but I used to be the Director of Health, Mental Health, Environmental Health, and Physical Education within the Office of Safe and Drug-Free Schools at the U.S. Department of Education. I want to thank Diane and Olga for your leadership on this important project. And so my presentation today is going to focus on the actual nuts and bolts of thinking about and applying for ED funding. As Diane just talked about, ED sort of uses 2 basic mechanisms to distribute funds to states and then to other folks out in the field. The formula grants, as Diane just went through, and then competitive, they're also called sometimes discretionary grants, but discretionary doesn't mean what it usually means in this context. These are programs that are authorized by the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. They're often have very prescriptive language, as Diane alluded to, about what the purpose of the grant is for. And these are grant programs in which eligible applicants, some of which I've listed here, including SEAs and LEAs, apply for the grants directly, usually to the Department of Ed, sometimes to the state. These applications are read, they're assessed by peer reviewers against specific selection criteria, and then they're ranked based on the scores that they receive. So as always, with funds that come from the Congress, these funds can vary from year to year, and sometimes funding doesn't actually come, it just doesn't happen in that particular year. So it's really important, if you're interested in a program specifically to fund efforts, to pay attention to what's going on in the appropriations process. ED has a very handy grant forecast on their website. The website is listed here, and again, these slides will be available to you after this broadcast. It's really important, though, to remember that this is just a grant forecast. It's a summary of all the potential competitive grant programs in the department. And it's always really important to stay in touch with the program office, to look at their website for dates, because sometimes they may vary from what the forecast says, and you don't want to miss the boat on an application period because the forecast was a week or two off. So I will say, when applying for Ed Fund in general, you're going to hear me say this again and again and again. It's important to read all the materials available to you, read them again and read them again. On the office website where the grant program originates, you'll see a little tab on the website that says applicant information. Within that, you'll find what's called the application package, which is sort of all the meat about the program competition. It includes the guidance and instructions, and it describes what's called the absolute priority. And as Diane explained, most of the programs we're talking about are designed to address other needs and issues in the education space. But often, social-emotional learning efforts can support or amplify these other efforts. And it's really important to understand what the basic legislative stated goal is, and again, that's called the absolute priority in the technical language. And then I'll talk about how to connect that in just a second. But also it's really important to understand if there are what's called competitive priorities. So is there a way for you to potentially get some extra points on your application? Sometimes it's depending on what kind of applicant you may be, or they're asking you to do a specific set of tasks. It really just depends on the competition. And then sometimes there are what's called invitational priorities, which indicate sort of what the department or the program office is thinking about. It gives you insight into what their priorities may be, but they don't actually sway the points necessarily in your application. It's just something to be aware of and think about as you write your application. Included in the application package is also reporting measures. Sometimes they're called indicators or grant measures. All grantees are required to collect data around these measures and then assess the effectiveness of the program specific to you and then the program in general. And then again, because your application will be reviewed by peer reviewers, it's important to understand the criteria against which your application will be reviewed. And the selection criteria are always spelled out pretty clearly in the applications, and that will give you an indication of how many points things are worth. And often there are notes underneath each of the selection criteria that give you some indication about what they may be looking for. So when applying and incorporating social-emotional learning into these program activities, it is really going to be on you as the applicant to explain the connection. So it's really important to understand and be able to articulate very clearly, very concisely, the theoretical framework that backs up what you're saying and the related literature. Citations are always helpful, and thanks to Olga and her annotated bibliography, this should really make your job a little easier. But it's really important to understand how what you're proposing supports the stated program goals. And so some questions you may also think as you are preparing your application are thinking about in the bigger picture, not just how does what you're proposing support the absolute priority or the stated goals of the program, but how does all of this work support your state and district strategic vision and plan for improving student learning? And how will this intervention help you get there? I would just say that it's often really helpful to be able to articulate all of this information and really place it in a bigger picture and a bigger context. And so it's also really important for you to think through what are the required elements of the intervention and what will they cost, and are the costs allowable in the program? You don't want to be in a position where you've proposed a staff-heavy intervention and then come to find out on the back end that whole part of the intervention was eliminated because staff time isn't supported by the program. So these are all things you want to think about when you're preparing your application. It's also important to understand, I sort of alluded to this before, how your proposed effort fits into a bigger picture and can be integrated into existing efforts to increase the odds that your effort will be sustained after the funding period. It's really helpful for you to be able to connect the dots on what's going on in terms of programming and policy and staff and community support, and how can what you're doing maximize or amplify the impact of what you want to do and what is already going on. If you're thinking about talking about other federally funded initiatives, you want to make sure that you are adding and supplementing and not replacing those funds with your proposed program. I've said it before, and I will say it again. It's always important, again, if you're not quite sure, to review the statute, review the supporting application materials, ask a lot of questions, talk to your colleagues, always contact the program office if you have specific questions, but there are so many resources and so many groups available and out there in the world to help you think through these connections, and I would definitely encourage you to take advantage of those. And if you have questions about ED programming in general, it's always a great idea to visit ED or any other funder's website, quite honestly. Social media is a great opportunity to figure out what the priorities of an organization may be. Department of Ed, Arnie Duncan, he's on Twitter and he tweets all the time. And it's helpful just to understand sort of what they're thinking, what their priorities are, and helping you think and formulate and craft what you think you might want to do. You may also want to consider becoming a peer reviewer for ED program grants or other grants for that matter as well. Not only do you learn about the grant program itself and the process, but you also get a good sense of what's appealing as a reader or not in a grant writing style, and that can be really helpful as you think through this process. Each program within Ed solicits usually their own peer reviewers, so it's just something to keep in mind. You'll have to apply maybe a couple of times. States also use peer reviewers, such as for 21st century proposals, so that's another opportunity to become a peer reviewer. And just one thing to say, and it seems obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway, but you can't be a peer reviewer in a competition for which you've already submitted an application or you're planning to do so. So with that, thank you, good luck, and we will take questions at the end.
So thank you so much, Dana. That was absolutely critical resource. Now we want to switch gears a little bit and really talk about when the rubber meets the road. And your next couple of presenters are going to talk about sort of how they have done this work at the local level. But before we do that, I wanted to get a sense of what people think are the largest barriers. So I'm going to ask for you to engage us in one more poll. And what do you believe to be the biggest barrier to implementing social and emotional development programs in schools or districts? And we'll close it when folks have finished voting. All right, so competing school and district priorities. So hopefully these next speakers will help you get a sense of how they were able to pursue these programs, securing different funding sources, but also making sure that this was a priority of their districts and communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie Kirshner, principal at Mary Todd Elementary School from Lexington, Kentucky.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share some things this afternoon because we all know as public educators, so many priorities, so few funds seems to be what we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And having been in public education for 27 years now and in many different types of schools in Iowa and Illinois and now in Kentucky, we had significant work ahead of us when I took over my current school in July of 2009. We are a high poverty school, about 500 students. We are 93 at this point, 93% of our students receive free or reduced lunch. About 28% of our students are English language learners. So that we have many of our students, the majority of our students come in with significant disadvantages. Over 50% of them come to us in kindergarten with little or absolutely no preschool experience whatsoever. So when they come to us, we have to teach them school. What is school? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How do I behave here? And because of that, with a very dedicated staff, we looked after my first 2 years here at some very significant data. And if you look at this current slide, we knew that number one, our students had high needs, that many of them lacked behavior models at home. About 16% of my students have parents, one or both parents who are currently incarcerated. So a lot of them are being raised by different family members. We just know there's so many different role models for them out there. And because of that, we knew that the school had to become the role model and that what we did here had to be critical. And for us, we educate the whole child, and we have to be concerned with academic, social, affective, everything. Because of that, we decided that we were going to have to look at direct socio-emotional learning, not just trying to see what we could pop in here and there within academics, but we had to have a specific program. To initiate that learning, we had to determine where the funding was going to come. And what we looked at the year that we chose is we went with Title I funds. We had a choice of purchasing materials for either reading intervention or this socio-emotional learning. And we decided that in order to get our students settled to the point where they would be able to learn academically, we were going to have to do something that was research-based, that was very intentional and very focused, and would help our children basically learn how to interact appropriately in order to be able to focus and then be able to learn academically. So data showed that behavior concerns were interrupting instruction very frequently, and we had two significant issues. We had a lot of bullying types of behaviors going on, and we had a lot of inappropriate interactions of other types going on among our students, basically not even being able to communicate with one another appropriately. So we knew that we had to go in a direction that would involve two different things. In 2011, 2012, we made an initial purchase of a program called Bully Blockers that was going to focus kindergarten through 5th grade on anti-bullying. Because of that, we also had a team that we formed. We have a full-time social worker. We used some Title I funds for that. We then brought our behavior specialist and our guidance counselor on board and our classroom teachers. If you look at the current slide, that was our socio-emotional learning team, which included basically the whole staff, but we had the social worker, behavior specialist, and guidance counselor spearheading the initial lessons for the programs. We purchased the Bully Blocker program with Title I funds, and that same year we began year one of, if you look at the right side of that slide, the Positive Behavior Intervention and Support Program. That was critical because it had us working together as a staff to do two important things. Number one, we were going to be very focused in teaching our children how they needed to behave in a bullying situation. And then we also had to look at how we could teach them correct behaviors. And with our PBIS team, we, as a staff, spent about 3 hours at the beginning of the 2011-2012 school year to develop a very specific set of what we called common area expectations. How to behave in the hallways, in the cafeteria, in the restrooms, on the playground, any of the areas where all of the students would be at one point or another during the day. With those intentional steps developed, we had posters throughout the building that spoke to what those procedures were in all those areas. And then we spent 2 days at the beginning of the school year teaching the students those behaviors. And we practiced. We looked at examples, practiced, went and had time in the classroom, came back the next day, took the children around to all the different common areas, again, practiced, talked about examples, and did that in a very deliberate way. We also practice those behaviors intentionally at the beginning of every semester. If we've had a 3 or 4 day weekend, we practice them the first day back. And we also practice them after winter break and spring break, of course, which are extended periods. What we do with those is if children are not behaving in those areas, we then went about looking at teaching them on their time. In other words, they would practice the correct behaviors if they're making inappropriate choices during their time, which would be their downtime, their sometimes break time. When they might have a choice to do something else, they're practicing what they need to do. Therefore, the whole staff was involved. And I know that sometimes, I noticed that a certain percentage of the groups were concerned about buy-in. Some of the viewers were worried about that. We had no problem with buy-in because a lot of our staff had been in the building for a number of years and seen what was going on and experienced the frustrations that come when students are struggling with behavior and the effect that it has on academics. So that buy-in was not difficult. It was deciding what the behavior should look like and then how we were going to teach them. And once we got that settled, it went smoothly as far as the initial implementation. We also spend 30 minutes each month during our whole staff meetings to discuss next steps, things that need to be tweaked, concerns about what's going on with the current behavior so that we can address those and move on together and work with the children effectively. So that was our first year. After 2012 when 2012 to 2013 rolled along, we moved into a newly renovated building. At that point, we also realized that our children were understanding more about how not to bully or what to do in a bullying situation. They knew how to behave in common areas and were working there, but we needed to teach them replacement behaviors for what they might be doing inappropriately. And that is when we went forward with our Title I funds to purchase the Second Steps curriculum, which had a strong research base. And at that point, our affective team, the classroom teachers had taken over the PBIS, those structures. The students, the classroom teachers were also taking over the reminders about bully blockers and what to do in those situations. And we were still spiraling back to those during the time that our SEL team would be out in the classrooms giving instruction. But we then added in a 30-minute weekly block of teaching the Second Steps curriculum. And in that situation, the behavior specialist, social worker, and guidance counselor divided and conquered classrooms as far as going in 30 minutes each week to teach a portion of the Second Steps curriculum, and then the regular classroom teachers follow up with reinforcing that on the day-to-day. There are 15-minute lessons that we are preparing to segue into in the second semester of this upcoming school year. Our SEL team will be scaffolding back from their classroom visits, and the regular classroom teachers will be doing 2 to 3 15-minute lessons every week with their students in Second Steps. We also found that in 2013, as we added those that program, the Second Steps in, if you look to the bottom of that slide, you'll now see that from 2011 to 2012, which was the beginning of our implementation of the Common Core Standards, or what we call the KCAS, we began our first year in the 5th percentile in student achievement statewide, and by year 2, with the PBIS plus bully blockers and the beginning of Second Steps in that second semester, we rose to the 21st percentile. More significantly is that third row in that chart. We went we cut our behavior referrals in half in a student population that had gone up in percentage of English language learner students. It had gone up by 11% in students on free and reduced lunch, but our behavior referrals came down significantly because the program was becoming systemic and we were implementing it with fidelity. If you look to this year, we are now in with this past year, we were in our first full year with all three going on the entire time: our positive behavior intervention and supports, our bully blockers, scaffolding back on that to segue more into focusing on the appropriate behaviors. We do not have test data yet. That will be coming back in August. Our academic rankings will come with that, but we have stayed basically static. With 50 more students in the building than last year, we have stayed static with the number of behavior referrals. So we know that we are, we're making really positive progress in that direction. One more thing I want to spend a couple minutes on that grew out of this socio-emotional learning is our district held a conference last year with Dr. Pedro Noguera, who is from the Steinhardt School of Education at NYU. He came to talk about equity, and he also talked about what we have to do with our high poverty students in order to really help them succeed. And backing up to that previous slide, you'll see that we developed as a school what we call the Singular 7. In reading and hearing Dr. Noguera speak and then studying the research of Angela Duckworth out of the University of Pennsylvania and Carol Dweck out of Stanford University, they did a lot of work on grit and the growth mindset, and also talking about resilience and how critical it is for students in order to learn, especially those from impoverished backgrounds. We knew that we had to go even another step further and integrate some other things in our academic programs for our students, and that is where the Singular 7 came. These 7 characteristics that we are working to help our students develop more deeply came from Paul Tough's book, came from reading of that, How Children Succeed, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character. In those, in the research that he did, he looked not only at what all kids need, but looked very specifically that in children whose early years include stress and deprivation, that can really impact the development of executive functions of self-regulation, problem solving, and attention control, that students do not develop the skills necessary for transition to elementary school without some real focused instruction once they get there. At this age, they've got to learn to persevere on increasingly cognitively demanding tasks, and they've got to comply with norms and rules. And as I said earlier, we teach our children, we have to teach them school. Every year, and especially our incoming kiddos, our incoming kindergartners. So what we do is, with the Singular 7, these are posted on a board in the front of our building. They're also posted in a bulletin board in my office, and I have every classroom of students visit me for a few minutes at the beginning of each school year, and when the teachers bring them in, and in my office we pile them in little circles, and we sit and look, and we talk about in kid-friendly terms what these 7 things are, and examples of what they would be and how they can show those in the classroom, and to remind them that because we are lucky that we have brains that grow, that we are able to learn these, and we are able to get better and better at them. With that, we build into our academic programs rewards and activities that help to build these in our students. We have an example. We give an award called the Principal's Pride and Joy. The Principal's Pride and Joy has been given over the past year for students that show one or more of these 7 things in an everyday situation. For example, we may have social intelligence is a big thing, because with our Second Steps program and our common area expectations and teaching our children appropriate behaviors, we also teach them that those things include taking care of those around us and being leaders. So if we see an older student helping a younger child unsolicited to get somewhere, to do something, taking care of them in the cafeteria, walking them down the hallway, anything like that, an adult catching them do that is allowed to nominate them for a Principal's Pride and Joy. We put those on our morning show. Those students get a special certificate. Their picture is taken. We have in a little caption which of those singular 7 they were, that they were caught exhibiting and why and what example they gave us. And then those stay up on this board in the front hallway all year long. Those students really, we have seen with those students that is something they will continue to do. And we have seen with some of our very most struggling students, especially those that struggle with behavior, that if they do something that earns a Principal's Pride and Joy, it has a marked effect on their academic performance and on their behavior in the classroom. So we're really excited to see how this is all working together. We also, when my director comes to speak to us, or we are giving feedback to Title I on our programs, or in our district, our school improvement plans that we update every 90 days, we look at them and look at how things are going. In the component that involves our affective, our socio-emotional learning, we will discuss things that have happened, reflections from teachers and students, and things that let us know that they are really, that they're really internalizing these things. And we also have to justify how these things are addressing the Common Core standards and what they do. One of the good examples that comes from Second Steps, as far as what it will do to help students with the Common Core, is as far as the English language, the English and Language Arts standards go, the lessons in Second Steps are centered around a story. So it gives students the opportunity to practice story interpretation. They also have to role play. So they are practicing speaking and learning. And they are also practicing important listening, because they learn reflective listening through some of these different Second Step modules. There's also a great Second Step problem-solving model that is really core to the thinking and reasoning skills that we use in math, science, and social studies. And that is, the children define what the problem is, what's going on, what's causing the conflict, what are some possible solutions, and then for each possible solution, the children ask themselves, is it safe? How might people feel about it? Is it fair? Will it work? And then their fourth step is that they choose a solution and use it. Then there is reflection involved, which is really critical for students, the self-reflection. They look back and they look, is it working? If this solution didn't work, they go back. What's another choice? So it teaches them that problem-solving process that we know is also so critical as far as the 21st century skills that we know are going to be important for them to acquire in order to become productive citizens and to be successful in career and workplace. So we are really, really excited to see what is going on, what's happening in our building with our students, and the growth that we're seeing from them socially and emotionally that we know would not be happening if we had not been very, very intentional with our use of funds and very intentional with our implementation of these very important programs. One, I'll close with just two examples that I got from my staff this year in different things. And one of them, when we were talking about the singular 7, we were talking about grit and really sticking to something until you do it right. And we had a student who was new to our school, and when she was asked to sit down, in our philosophy of mastery learning and to make corrections, so we made sure that she was understanding. Initially, when she was told by the teacher that she needed to sit down, try again, she would let out this really heavy sigh and say, "What?" And, when they would ask her to practice, she now would smile, make the corrections. Her attitude became much more positive. And the really critical thing about this example is she began to say, "Okay, I'll do that right now." And after a couple of weeks of her attitude turning around and looking, the teacher caught her telling classmates to do the same thing. So not only was she learning grit, but she was using what she had learned, and she was trying to help her classmates do that as well. And the teacher also shared that she would smile when she'd catch her own mistakes and while she was making the corrections. So it's really critical. Another example is in several of our classrooms, we use anchor charts throughout the building. We feel they're very critical for academic achievement. But we also have a system for our younger students as they learn to read, to build stamina in their reading so that they can read for longer and longer periods of time. We have classrooms, one of our first grade classrooms, she had a grit chart that the teacher put up, and the students were recording those minutes every week that they were able to read independently and to stay focused. And they talked about that being exciting. They would come to me and say, "We're up to 12 minutes." So it was really something that when we were, again, intentional and implementing it throughout the academics, that we're seeing some really good things happening in our school. So I really appreciate the time to talk about this, and I probably went way over my 20 minutes, ladies, but I thank you for the opportunity to share.
You did a great job, and Carrie, congrats again on such wonderful work. I think you're showing through your examples how small steps in one child's life really can spread and transform the school. I just wanted to remind folks, many of you are jumping in and asking questions via the chat function, but that's one opportunity that you have to get your questions answered before we turn over to the Q&A. But speaking of 21st century skills, I wanted to turn over to our final presenter, last but not least, Betsy Morgan Kelly, who's the state coordinator at New York 21st Century Community Learning Centers in Albany, New York.
Hi, everyone. I'm Betsy Kenny. I'm really grateful to be part of this webinar. I think it's so important to talk about social emotional learning and how we're blending funding and really bringing it to the forefront now more than ever. I'm the supervisor of education programs in the Office of Student Support Services here at the State Education Department in New York. And our office focuses on the important elements that undergird students' academic success. We're expanded learning opportunities, of which I'll speak to 21st Century in a little bit, health, school safety, pupil personnel services, including homeschooling, school guidance, attendance, Dignity for All Students Act, which is a New York initiative, RTI, and more. So we're busy. And we have cousins under the larger umbrella of Student Support Services, and they are the Office of Child Nutrition and the Office of Early Learning. So really you can see that we are the Social and Emotional Development Learning team here at State Ed. Next slide, please. So in the last 4 or 5 years here in New York, a new focus on social emotional learning has come to the forefront. And I think it would be helpful to spend a few minutes talking about how New York is garnering support for the importance of SEL from top down at SED, State Ed, you may hear me refer to it as SED, from our community, and even from the governor's office. In our state, just to make you aware of our system here, the Board of Regents is the governing body for the State Education Department. And the regents are responsible for the general supervision of all educational activities within the state. They preside over the State Education Department. They give direction to our Commissioner of Education and the other senior managers here at State Ed. There are 17 members of the board, and they're selected by our state legislator for 5-year terms. So the regents really understand that in order for New York students to do well academically, they need many supportive factors surrounding their education. And in order to be college, career, and citizen ready, they need these things that you'll see on this circle. And to do well in performing academically, they need safe school climate. They need social and emotional development. We need strong parent engagement and communication with families. Early learning, early childhood literacy and numeracy. They need to come into kindergarten already having a basis of knowledge. And in regard to that, the governor has just released another request for proposals here in New York for over $300 million for universal pre-K. Meaningful content. School needs to be meaningful. We need to have that academic rigor. We need to expect more for our kids. They will rise. We need to have engaging pathways through academics and also this expanded learning and social and emotional and consistent supports. So all of these things matter. I think we've talked here at Student Support Services, if a school is all about academic rigor and not weighted at all in social and emotional learning, things are not going to go well. And vice versa, if it's all squishy social and emotional learning stuff and no academic rigor, not going to go well. So it's really finding the balance, and our regents here understand that. Next slide, please. So in 2011, the regents adopted the guidelines and resources for social and emotional development and learning here in New York. And these guidelines were developed in our office here in Student Support Services in partnership with an advisory group of community stakeholders who regularly convene to inform the process and content for the guidelines. And you'll hear as I go through on different initiatives in New York, you'll hear me speak to the community involvement, which I think is critical in pushing the momentum for social emotional development and learning. Although voluntary for schools, this action of adopting the guidelines by the regents signaled another layer of commitment and understanding that successful schools realize strong academic outcomes by combining high-level behavioral and academic expectations with equally high levels of student and adult support. The guidance document aims to give New York State school communities a rationale and the competence to address child and adolescent affective development as well as cognitive development. And again, that's the balance of rigor with the social and emotional component. And then along came the Common Core standards. And so for a few years, yes, we've all been working hard on curriculum and implementing the Common Core, and that's been the focus for the regents, for the State Education Department, for schools and districts across the state and across the nation. But I think now that the Common Core is becoming, settling into our worlds, we're circling back here in New York to the importance of social and emotional learning. Next slide, please. So in 2013, the regents reestablished our Safe Schools Task Force. We had one previous in several years past, and we brought it back to the fore in 2013. And members of the task force include educators from around the state, Division of Criminal Justice, various community agencies, mental health providers, the governor's office, the New York State School Board, and others who are invested in creating sustaining safe schools for kids. We have 3 committees within the Safe Schools Task Force, and they're focused on 3 areas: school culture and student engagement, safe schools data use and reporting, and building security and infrastructure. We also had a student forum that was held early this spring, and we brought over 60 middle school, high school students from around the state during their winter break to help inform the task force work. And they really, I just have to tell you that they were living proof that the future of our society is in good hands. I mean, they had all those elements that Carrie spoke to, the Singular 7. So next week, the committees, they've been working hard as a committee, and next week their top priority recommendations will be presented to the regents, and a concrete plan for action will be implemented to improve safety and enhance positive school culture in schools for our kids. So it's pretty exciting. Next slide, please. And most recently, besides the pre-K monies, the governor has also released $30 million in grants for community schools around the state to be administered by our office here at SED. We don't have any downtime here. We're working closely with the governor's staff, the Council for Children and Families, the Office of Mental Health, the National Center for Community Schools, and others to provide support and guidance to schools as they develop these community hubs. So we're really excited, and as you can see, there's a great deal of support from the top down around the importance of social and emotional development and learning as a means to create an environment where students can optimize their learning here in New York. Because really, I've said this several times, if we think about back to our own personal experiences and positive experiences in school, most of the time those memories and those experiences are likely tied to an emotional response of some sort. And for me, it was athletics. For some, it may be getting that A in math. For me, it was passing math. But whatever it is for you, my guess is that there was some social and or emotional component to the event that caused a positive shift in your life. And so that's the critical piece. That's the balance that we need to keep bringing to our kids in school. Next slide, please. So for those education department folks from around the nation who might be on the call, I just want to quickly share how, as internal offices at State Ed, we finally found a common pathway to social and emotional learning, and it's through expanded learning time. We often work in silos within SED. Everybody's working really hard in their areas of expertise, but rarely do we get to come together as an internal learning community, and we find that ELT is the key. So we have folks that's sitting around the table. We've met a couple of times, and we're going to try to keep it going. Our Office of Student Support Services and Office of Accountability, which includes Title I, homeless, many of the funding sources that are in the guide kind of are administered by the offices you see here on the slide. The School Turnaround Office is the School Improvement Grants. We have special education at the table because that's a critical piece. Charter schools, they've been doing creative things in expanded learning for a while, so we want their voice as well. So, as I said, this system that we've created, it's very exciting for us. And we also discuss at our meetings streamlining monitoring protocols, other ways that we can assist schools in meeting their deliverables without having us all go in as separate offices to say, I need this, and then somebody else goes next week and asks for it differently, but it's the same information. So creating that learning community has been exciting. Next slide, please. So we're also, in addition to our internal work group, some of us on this work group sit on the steering committee for expanded learning time in New York State, which is coordinated with the National Center for Time and Learning and the After School Corporation and some others. And we're in the draft stages of developing a definition for ELT for New York. And I've just cited one of the indicators that speaks directly to SEL, and that is that expanded learning time will foster a school culture of safety, support, and social and emotional growth, where high expectations for students and staff are clearly articulated and supported through appropriate policies, procedures, and/or practices that adhere to NYSED's social and emotional learning guidelines. We're also trying to make sure, because the guidelines are voluntary, we keep pushing people back. We're driving traffic back to the guidelines as much as we can. And as we move away from the agrarian calendar now to the longer school days for kids, we know that we can't keep them in their seats all day, and that we have to offer opportunities for engaging, enriching activities that complement their learning. And these activities and social emotional learning development is just such a key component. Next slide, please. So, 21st Century Community Learning Centers. I know that was why I was asked to be on this call. So I just want to explain to you that New York was one of the states that requested in the ESEA waiver to allow for 21st Century program to operate during the school day. So when we were developing the application for the waiver, I just want to share another example of how the community voice is valued at SED, and in some of the comments and guidance we received from providers when applying for the waiver. You can see those above, emphasizing really that partners from outside the school can customize experience for kids, activate their learning while building those foundational social emotional schools that will culminate in success school, college, and careers. And the after school New York State After School Network was really a key contributor to the waiver language because they really gathered input from around the state and presented it to SED in a clear and thoughtful way. So if you have after-school networks in your state and are looking for funding or wanting to know more about funding for 21st century or expanded learning time, that's a key place for you to find that information. And in the waiver application, we specifically discussed how the next 21st century RFP for discretionary funds must include implementation models that embody research-based expanded learning opportunities that improve not only academic but the social and emotional outcomes for kids. Next slide, please. So you can see this is a direct language if some of you want to take it and put it in your own RFPs, or you want to be thinking about that going forward. These are some of the deliverables that are required through our request for proposal for 21st century community learning centers. That they have the work that you're doing in 21st century has to support the overall academic focus and integration of academic support, social and emotional development. They need to develop and sustain meaningful partnerships between schools and high-quality community partners. They need to embody research-based principles of exemplary expanded learning opportunities and ensure that these guidelines for New York are reflected in opportunities for youth development and enrichment through hands-on project-based activities, service learning, and other experiences not typically offered in the classroom setting. So the goal of the 21st Century Community Learning Centers is to complement that academic rigor, not to supplant it, not to, you should always be working in tandem with your schools to complement what kids are learning and give them these other opportunities. And we've made these deliverables that you see on the slide are also part of our monitoring tool. So folks know what they have to do, they go after it, and we check in with them. So finally, on the last slide, please. Just want to give you, Carthage Central School was highlighted in the funding guide. It's a neat area. It's up by Fort Drum, above Syracuse, near Watertown, and 58% of the students are from transient military families. They're coming and going. They're moving a lot. Maybe some of you on this call grew up in a military family, and so you can relate to that. So the after-school 21st Century program, provides all these things. They provide social and emotional support, individual and in groups, academic support, and they also have counseling, life skills coaching, and special assistance to families as they need it, and including these military families. So just an example of how these elements all came together for a group of students from Carthage who attend the 21st Century program. There's a group of 4 kids. They were high school students. 2 of them are from military families, 2 are not. 2 grew up there. They entered the Myth Olympics at Clarkson University. Clarkson is known for its engineering programs. It's highly sought after university for that. And the Myth Olympic Games is a partnership between Alcoa Foundation and Clarkson University to promote STEM activities. And the kids developed a hypothesis that actual shark skin created less drag than swimsuits made for competitive swimming that are supposed to act like shark skin. And they actually found shark skin. They had trouble finding it, but they found some shark skin, and they used badminton, birdies. It's fascinating to watch the video. We're obviously not going to watch it today, but I encourage you to watch it. And in the end, these 4 kids from Carthage took first place in the Mythbuster style competition, first place in the laboratory write-up portion, and they were awarded first place overall in the competition. And each student will receive a $20,000 scholarship if they choose to attend Clarkson. I get kind of choked up because these are 21st century dollars and social emotional learning at work. So what you'll see in the video, besides fascinating science experiment, is a group of these high schoolers who are engaged, and they show confidence, poise, humor, natural curiosity, gratitude. As Carrie was speaking about, they show zest, they show grit, they show optimism, and these are just the critical life skills that every individual needs to be college, career, and citizen ready. So, what more could you ask for? Thanks.
Thank you again, Betsy. I think you've just shown how your work breaking down silos and really creating those multi-sector, cross-cutting collaborations has driven a lot of success with the New York State program. So thanks for giving us some very practical ways to pursue social emotional learning strategies. We now are going to open it up for questions, and I am going to start with some of the questions that came through the chat functions. And so to get to some of the pressing ones, I wanted to first turn to Carrie and ask a question that came through, but I believe that Diane or Olga may want to elaborate. But first, Carrie, how did you make the argument in your grant proposals to use Title I fundings for social-emotional learning? In particular, this person wanted to know what data you used, including, and mentioned specifically the Weisberg data. And then, is this a usual use of Title I monies? And is it recognized?
In our district, in the high poverty schools, we have not met with any, resistance to it. Because if we are using a program that, when we looked at our behavior data and we looked at, what was going on and in working with my staff and talking with teachers and talking about what was going on, our argument, for Title I, what we basically put in our school-wide plan was, in order for our classrooms to be centers of learning, we have got to help our children be focused. We have got to have a way to teach them appropriate behaviors that they're not walking into school with in order for them to be able to achieve. And when we place that argument, when we put that argument in front of our Title I folks, we didn't meet with any resistance at all, because they knew, they knew our school. They knew what we were trying to accomplish, and they knew that with what we already had in place academically, if it wasn't happening, there was something else that we had to be able to do. Does that help? I'm hoping that answers the question.
I think it helps. Do Diane or Olga want to elaborate on how usual this is, or looking at it from a big picture landscape, or even Dana?
Well, this is Diane. I wouldn't say it's unusual, but again, folks usually think of Title I as supporting an academic program, but I believe that it's a very strong case to be made that social emotional learning supports the academic achievement of students. And really, I think we all recognize now that Title I is much more clearly focused on improving achievement in general than necessarily as narrowly focused as it used to be in the the 70s and 80s and even early 90s on just math and reading achievement. So, I don't have any firsthand knowledge to say, oh yes, everybody's using it, but I would say that it's probably a fairly likely easy sell to make when you back it up with the information research that shows that it does support student achievement and student learning.
And this is Olga, and I would just add that, the empirical studies that are outlined in the annotated bibliography, which is hopefully just a sort of a tool that might provide a shortcut for those who need to quickly identify what some of the relevant literature. And what's included were pretty rigorous studies. I mean, quasi-experimental or experimental studies that were able to demonstrate that, implementing these sort of, with fidelity, the social emotional learning programs really did have, again, not just the behavioral outcomes that we might want, but specifically academic achievement outcomes. So I do think that the literature is there. It continues to grow, and there are a number of places that I think repositories of these studies that are fairly accessible, I think, to everyone who might need them in the community.
And this is Diane. Just one more thing to add to this. If you look at the School Improvement Grants Program, which has been more recently sort of revised through regulation than No Child Left Behind, a component of the turnaround models that are supposed to be implemented with those funds does say social emotional learning initiatives. So I think the evolution of the U.S. Department of Ed, if you take the School Improvement Grants as a recognition of that, shows that social emotional learning is a key component of student achievement.
And this is Dana. I would just add, sometimes it just depends on the way you phrase things or frame things. And so to be very clear and very deliberate in framing what you intend to do around again, the goals of the program, so academic outcomes, and I'm not just going to say achievement, but all these other pieces that go into educational outcomes. So the disciplinary referrals, the behavioral stuff, if you will. Sometimes it really helps to just think about the way you're framing it and recognize that sometimes administrators have some rather outdated ideas about what quote unquote social emotional learning means, and to be sensitive to that, and to back it up, again, as Olga and Diane were both saying, with the research that is widely available and pretty rigorous and pretty reliable.
So Dana, to that point, one of the questions that came in was for grants and funds awarded to LEAs, local education agencies, does the LEA identify the specific social emotional learning program or intervention and application, or identify that program after the funding is awarded? What are the ingredients?
Well, it depends. The General Counsel will be very proud of me for saying it depends. But in large part, when you submit an application, not just to Department of Ed, but to many or most funders, the expectation is that you have a pretty firm idea of the intervention that you want to do. So whether that's a program or a set of policies or some staff time, you want to have a pretty good idea of what you would do if you got this money. At Department of Ed, I can say from experience that we typically wanted people to stick to what they said they were going to do in the application. Now, if it turns out that a program isn't going to be feasible for one reason or another, you would work with your grant officer to otherwise achieve the goals and objectives. But you want to have a pretty good idea of what it is you want to do. And again, it doesn't necessarily always have to be about a program per se, but also the other infrastructure pieces that you want to put into place that will enhance the potential for sustainability once the program period ends. So again, things like thinking about policies or community connections and engagement. What are the supports you can leverage during this program period that will, again, sort of put in place an infrastructure that will endure after the program period ends.
Perfect. So turning to Olga for a second and building on this theme of, putting these programs into the place. Olga, can you discuss, or Diane, does the guide discuss how the staff who are implementing social emotional learning, so we're thinking about the counselors and the social workers, teachers too, can be funded in addition to the programs themselves?
This federal guide actually does not go to that level of detail. It's really intended to be a resource that's fairly general and could hopefully be utilized regardless of the program or approach that a community may decide to implement. But what is coming, we hope very soon, is we have a partnership with CASEL where we have started to compile what we like to call a suite of products, one of which is a tool that will help school districts figure out the specific kind of targeted costs associated with any particular program that one may decide they want to implement. So the kind of hidden costs that one doesn't always think about, in addition to how much the curriculum might cost, there are other things in addition to staff time or supervision time or particular assessment tools that have to be bought that sometimes aren't thought about sort of clearly. And so we have together kind of jointly with some help of an outside expert brought together that resource, and that will be made available fairly soon, probably within the next couple of months. And we'll be happy to send an announcement out to all the registrants when that becomes publicly available. But those are the kinds of things that will hopefully allow one to get down to a much more specific level about how much it would cost. And it really does depend, obviously, on the community's decision about what's the best match and what they're ready for in terms of social emotional programs and practices.
And I wonder if Carrie and Betsy in particular might speak to how, how they've been building in some of those costs of those personnel pieces as they build out their programming.
This is Betsy. For 21st Century, folks can build their budgets specific to this program, and we do allow portions of social workers, guidance administrators, those kinds of things to be paid for with 21st Century funds as long as they're working with the kids directly. And then there are some administrative dollars allowed for teacher training and staff training and professional development, possibly some turnkey training from those guidance counselors and social workers to bring those elements that Carrie was talking about that are happening during the day to make sure that the after-school staff are aware, and so they're following through and kids feel the same climate throughout the day. So we do allow those costs to be included in 21st Century grants as long as they're written into the grant and they align with the goals and objectives of the program.
Thank you.
Yeah, and from my end of it, that's exactly what we do with our staffing. When we're given our staffing workbook and we have so many positions, we prioritize what we do with that, and then how many positions we can use there that are given us by the district. And then with our Title I funds, that's where if we were only able to, the district gives us like a 0.8 of the social worker, we purchase the other two. The other 2/10, so that we're able to have her full time and have her fully invested in our programs. And in that way, we're able to structure some of that day, as far as having her help. With our guidance counselor, with our behavior specialist, because those are positions that are funded by the school, we have we are able to determine as a staff and within our building exactly how those folks work with kiddos. So
that's really good practical advice too on how to this happen. I also received another question directed towards you, Carrie, that asked about was there anything else that your school did that could contribute to rise in academic rankings and drop in referrals. So I'm going to interpret that as meaning beyond the social emotional learning things. What else helps?
We have a lot of different things that we do, but I think the number one thing that is critical to us is that the mission and vision. The vision of our school is that every child get what they need in order to be successful. What our mission in that is to make sure that we provide the situations in order for that to happen. With our staff, and especially in a school that has so many children that come from some very, some very difficult circumstances, relationships are the absolute number one priority for us in working with each other and in working with our students. So that what we also have, as well as the besides the bully blockers, the second steps, the programmatic things that are part of our curriculum, those things that are part, we also have a Check and Connect program, we call it. It's called several things, but we have what our Tier 3 students that struggle with behavior and with emotional outbursts and things like that. They are adopted, if you would, by a staff member that checks in with them 2 to 3 times a day to see how they're doing and becomes a touch point for them. And they're also the person that a lot of times will work with the family too. Will communicate with the family because that relationship is very special in that way. So we do have that. That is one piece that we have. We also have, we are really blessed to have a full-time Family Resource Center. Our Family Resource Center coordinator looks for programs, and sets up family involvement situations and events. We use our Title I family involvement nights. We have had 12 of them this year because it's so critical for us to involve the families. We realize how important that is. So we use everyone that's involved in the building to work with kids and to really focus on those kids that struggle. So I would say those are some of the extra pieces. We also have, thanks to our local health department, we do have a clinic. We only get her a couple days a week, but we do have a licensed clinical social worker as well who's able to counsel and work with some of our children that have some, some of the larger needs and whose parents otherwise would not be able to get them services. So there's, and I think those would be the big things that I would add on that, that are helping us.
Perfect. That's really helpful. So we are coming to a close, but I did want to, I will give you one more question, and I'm kind of going to take from a bunch of different questions that have been submitted and talk about eligibility. There's a number of you who have asked about eligibility, specifically if faith-based organizations are eligible, and someone asked with specifically related to the 21st century work, whether or not sports entities would be eligible and when that RFP was coming out. So I'm hoping that Dana and Betsy can elaborate. And after that, I will ask Olga and Diane to close us out by letting us know where we can find many of the important materials that are coming.
Okay, thank you. This is Dana, and regarding the question about faith-based organizations, eligibility, religious institutions, it really depends on the program. Again, it depends. And if what is called a community-based organization is an eligible applicant for the program, faith-based organizations, as long as they have 501c3 status, they're considered nonprofit entities and have that designation by the IRS. They're considered, and they serve a specific group of the community. There is an established relationship. There are definitions in the applications about community-based organizations, but pretty typically, faith-based organizations are considered community-based organizations. But again, it depends whether they're the eligible applicant or not. Some are just available to LEAs or SEAs or other groups like that. So that's in general. And Betsy?
For New York State, faith-based organizations are absolutely eligible. And we also have community-based organizations, but faith-based can operate as a faith-based organization or under the auspices of a community-based organization.
So thank you. Olga and Diane, is there anything else that you want to say about, I see that the resources are up where people can find them?
Yeah, so I want to thank everyone for really their time and their interest. Just want to remind everyone that the recording and the slides will be available on either of our websites at either center at George Washington University. And that in addition, what will be in the slides are more detailed bios and and ways to contact any of the individual presenters in case folks have additional questions. We do want you to know that in addition to the slides and the archived audio portion of this, we will also be responding to the other questions that we weren't able to answer today, and we will post those answers online. So please do stay in touch with us. Thank you so much for your time and your interest.
So thanks again to all. I want to thank the panelists. All their information was rich and very practical and something that you can use. Just to answer one more question, in addition to the guide that we talked about today, many of the resources and materials that Olga talked about are on that website, including the annotated bibliography with all those citations and references that have been mentioned. So please, please look out for follow-up materials as well as follow-up to any unanswered questions. And I want to thank you for joining us today. Goodbye, everyone.